All right, we ended off with Achir yesterday. Now we're going to talk about Rabbi Akiva, who was the only one of the four sages who emerged unscathed from the Pardes. We're on the bottom of Tesvavim at Beis. Rabbi Akiva, bottom two lines. Allah b'shalom v'yorad b'shalom. He went up in peace and he came back down in peace from this mystical or philosophical speculation out of body experience. Ve'olav hakasav omer moshcheni acharecha narutza. And about him the pasuk says, moshcheni acharecha, draw after me, and we will run together. In other words, Hashem was basically welcoming Rabbi Akiva and allowing him into his inner sanctum. V'af Rabbi Akiva bikshu malachi hasharas l'dochvo. But Rabbi Akiva, the angels wanted to push him away. And Amar lahem HaKadosh Baruch Hu hanichu l'zaken zeh sheroi l'ishtamish bichvodi. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to the angels, leave him alone. He is worthy of becoming part of my inner glory. So my Darash. So the question is, what did he expound upon in order to avoid the pitfalls that the other three sages fell into? Either because they gazed directly at Hashem, or because they came to an erroneous theological conclusion based on seeing certain angels that resembled God, like we learned about Acher before. So Amar Rabba Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Ve'asa merivivos kodesh, as it says in Vizos HaBracha, that God comes from the multitudes of holiness. So the word Va'asa could also be read as Oshu, that it is a sign, B'Revav Shalo, in God's multitude, which means that HaKadosh Baruch Hu distinguishes himself, and all you have to know is to look for that distinction of Hashem, so that you'll know not to confuse him, and you'll also know not to gaze directly at him as Ben Zoma did, and who became injured as a result. V'Rebbi Avahu Amar Dagol B'Revava Dugmahu B'Revava Shalo. Also, we have another pasuk that says Dagul Me Revava, that God is distinguished or flagged amongst his multitude, which means again the same idea that God is recognizable from amidst his multitude of angels. V'Reish Lakish Amar Hashem Tzivako Shemo Adon Hu B'Tzivah Shalo. Also it says Hashem Tzivakos, and using the word Hashem, it means the master of. Hashem is the master of his army, and therefore you can, just like you can tell who the general is in an army, you can always tell who the Ribbon Shalom is, even when you go up to the mystical realm and you see angels that resemble God. Rabbi Chia bar Abba Amar Rabbi Yochanan, lo v'ruach Hashem v'achar ruach ra'ash lo v'rash Hashem v'achar harash eish lo v'eish Hashem v'achar ha'eish kol demama daka b'nei Hashem over. And there's another pasuk that shows you that you can look for, the signs for when Hashem is present, and that is from the story of Eliyahu on Har Chorev when Hashem appears to him, and it says that there was a great wind, and after the wind there was a great sound, but God was not in the great sound, and afterwards there was a fire, but God was not in the fire, and after that there was a very small still voice, and only there would you find Hashem. So Rabbi Akiva knew that, and he knew where to look, and he knew where to avoid. Tana Rabbanan Shisha Dvarm Nemru B'Shedim Shlosha Kimalachi Hasharis Shlosha Kivnei Adam. Now this brisa doesn't seem to be in any way attached, but I think we'll find it a connection in just a second. There are 6 features or characteristics of Shedim. Shedim are, according to the Sfarim, are a physical creation, but are made of the 2 elements that are the most ethereal. They're made out of fire and air, whereas other creatures also have earth and water comprising them. The reason why we don't see Shedim is because they're made out of only fire and air, but they still are physical beings. So in 3 respects they are like angels, and in other 3 respects they're like human beings. Shlosha kimalachi hashares eshlem kinafayim kimalachi hashares. Number 1, they have wings like the angels. V'tasin misof ha'olam v'yatsofu kimalachi hashares. They fly from one end of the world to the other like angels. V'yodin masha asid lios kimalachi hashares. And they know what will be in the future, just like angels. So the Gemara says, Yodin sal gadaitach. How can you tell me that Shedim know what's going to be in the future? The Gemara says that doesn't seemingly seem possible if you're confined to the physical world. So Ela shomen me'achari hapargud kimalachi hasharis. But rather, it is that the Shedim can hear from beyond the divine curtain what Hashem has pronounced, and that's how they get knowledge of the future. Ushlosha kivnei adam. But there are 3 features that they have that make them analogous to human beings. Ochlin v'shosin kivnei adam. They eat and drink like human beings. That's why there's an issue of not drinking from certain water sources where if you fear that Sheda may have contacted. Parin v'ravin kivnei adam, they multiply like human beings, they reproduce like human beings. Umesim kivnei adam, and they die like human beings as well. Tosfos points out that there are additional features that Shedim have that make them like mortal beings, but that's subsumed under these three categories. Shisha dvarim nemru bivnei adam shlosha k'malachei hasharis. Now there are 6 features of human beings, and 3 of those 6 features they are like angels, and 3 of these characteristics make them analogous to animals. And this is where I think is the connection, because we were talking about the Arbosh Nichnasu Lapardes, they ascend up to heaven, and they encounter danger, and because really, in one sense, they're like angels, but human beings are not like angels, so therefore it's a very, very precarious endeavor to try and ascend up to heaven. Shlosha Kimalachi Hashares, Yeshlem Das Kimalachi Hashares. In the 3 following respects, they are like angels. They have intellect like the angels. Umahalchin become a Zekufa Kimalachi Hashares, they stand erect like angels. Umasaprin Belashan HaKadosh Kimalachi Hashares, and they can speak the holy tongue, which shows that they are imbued with a certain spark of holiness like angels. And Shlosha Kivahema, and in the following 3 respects, they're like animals. Shosin, Ochlin v'Shosin kivahema, Parin v'Ravin kivahema, Motzin rei kivahema. They eat and drink like animals, they reproduce like animals, and they excrete waste product like animals. So therefore, one has to know that human beings are limited because of this hybrid type of existence.
Interesting, they didn't say that they die like animals, but they chose the other thing.
Yeah, that is interesting, isn't it? Probably because there are certain features.
Maybe when we die, we don't die completely, and animals do.
Right.
There's no afterlife.
That's a possibility. That maybe that's why the Gemara didn't choose that. Good. Okay. If a person looks at any of these 4 things, he gazes at them, contemplates them, it's worthy of him never having been brought into the world. So, what were those 4 things? What is above, what is below, what is before, and what is after? So the Gemara says, Bishlama malamayla malamata mala ochar lechayi. I can understand extending beyond your purview if you try to look above the rakia, below the rakia, if you try to look at what's going to happen in the future. So that those are all things that are beyond human conception. However, elulafanim madahava, but looking back in time, before Hashem created the world, what's the big deal? Now the Gemara, I think, could have answered that the mind is not set to comprehend certain things that are before time and space. But the Gemara gives a totally different answer. The Gemara's answer is, Rabbi Yochanan Rabbi Elazar Darmi to Ravayu, Mashal Melech Basar V'dam Shamala Avadav Benuli Palterin Gedolin Al Ha'ashba Halchu Ubanulo Ein Ratzon Shamelech Lahaskir Shem Ashba. They say we can compare this to a king who tells his servants, build me a palace on a garbage dump. You ever drive through Staten Island? Right? So you know that half of Staten Island is a garbage dump. So, and then you can build over it. So the king says, build me a palace in Staten Island. Right? So when they build it, the king doesn't want people to remind him that his palace is built on an old garbage dump. And so that's why it's not appropriate to delve into what happened before creation. Now, what does this imply? This implies, as the Mekubalim write, Rabbeinu Bechaya writes this in his Perush on Chumash, that this is not the first world that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu created this world using debris, recycled material from a previous inferior world, and we're in a progression of tikkun. We're in a progression of perfection. And our world has a certain function of perfection, using the Torah, using the certain imperfections that exist in this world. But this is all very, very esoteric, and it's not appropriate for a person to contemplate what garbage, right, what debris of a previous world existed before Hashem created our world. Now, of course, this is problematic because the Rambam says that we're meant to believe in kriyatio ex nihilo, in creation from nothing, and this Gemara applies that there was not a creation from nothing, but there was something upon which God based this world. But that's a very, very complex issue we won't have time to go into. Kol shelo chas al kvod kono rasi lo shelo balo olam. The Mishnah had also said that anyone who does not worry about the honor of his creator is worthy of not having been created. So Maihi, what does it mean to not worry about God's honor? Rabbi Abba Omar Zam Mistakal Bekeshes. If you gaze directly at a rainbow, Rav Yosef Omar Zeha Over Avera B'Soser. Rav Yosef disagrees. He says, if you sin in secrecy, this is also a sign that you don't care about God's honor. We're going to explain each one. Mistakal bekeshes, what does it mean to gaze at a rainbow? Dichsiv kimarei hakeshes asher yiyeh ba'anan b'yam hageshem kin marei hanogas aviv hu marei demus kavod Hashem. Part of Yechezkel's vision of the Maaseh Merkava, he describes a certain aura that is surrounding the divine throne that looks like a rainbow. And that is descriptive of the glory of God. So by looking directly into a rainbow, you're being disrespectful to that which is representative of Hashem's glory, of Hashem's Shekhinah. Rav Yosef Omar.
They're nice looking, So
they're beautiful. They're amazing. You can be inspired by them. So the Gemara is saying, don't stare at it. Look at it, admire it, and then move on.
Make a bracha.
You're right. You're supposed to. You make a bracha, right? Zocher abris, right? Rav Yosef Omar Zeha Oiver Avera B'Saser. Rav Yosef says no. It's a person who sins in secrecy. He says because it's like anytime you sin secretly, it's as if you're pushing God's feet away from this world. Shenemar, what do we mean? That God says the heavens are my throne and the earth is my footstool. By you sitting in secrecy, you're basically implying that God's not here. You're sort of rejecting that God has a foothold in this world and is completely providential and is aware of what's going on. By you sitting secretly, you're saying, well, I just don't want people to see me, but I don't care about God because God's not looking. So that's why it's considered to be disrespectful, heretical, and so forth. So the Gemara says, Ani, is this really so, that it's wrong to sin in secrecy? Rabbi Law said just the opposite, that if a person's Yetzer Hara is getting the best of him, he should go to a place where people don't recognize him. Disguise yourself in dark clothing. Do whatever you need to, whatever you want to do. So as long as you don't make a Chilul Hashem publicly. So you see that it's better to sin in secrecy than to sin publicly. How can you tell me that it's wrong? So the Gemara says, Lo kasha hadamatzi kayef liyitzrei, hadalomatzi kayef liyitzrei. The difference is it depends on the attitude. If a person is sinning in secrecy because he realizes he knows Hashem is looking, but he says, but I can't control myself, I got to do this, and I just don't want to make a Chilul Hashem, so then that's considered to be more virtuous to do it in secrecy. But if you're sinning in secrecy is because you don't believe that God is looking, so then that's considered to be dishonoring Hashem.
Or if he knows this Gemara.
I guess if you know the Gemara.
He knows the
right?
Gemara.
There's a whole question as far as what this Gemara means. We saw it recently in Moed Katan as well, just a couple of weeks ago. And if you take a look in Tosfos says that it literally means that if you really feel that you cannot control yourself, this is the best, the lesser of two evils. Darish Rabbi Yehuda b'Rabbi Nachmani mitur Gemani Deresh Lakish Kol Mistakel Begimel Devarim Ein of Kehos. That if you look at three things, your eyes will grow dim because you're misusing your gift of eyesight. And what are the three things? Because you're sort of dishonoring Hashem by looking directly at things that are representative of His glory. Bekeshes uvenasi uvekohanim. A rainbow, the leader of the Jewish people, the president of the Jewish people, and the Kohanim during their duchening. Bekeshes tichsiv kemari hakeshes asher yihiyeh b'anan b'yom hageshem umari devus kavod Hashem. Like the reason you can't look at a rainbow or your eyes will grow dim is like we said, because that's representative of Hashem's glory, like from Yechezkel's vision. Benasi dichsiv benasata mehodecha alav. And what about the looking at the president or the leader of the Jewish people? Well, we know that Hashem told Moshe, place some of your glory that is representative of the Shekhinah and pass it on to Yehoshua. So we see that the Nasi of each generation has the Shekhinah resting upon him. So by looking or gazing or staring directly at him, it's also dishonoring Hashem. And finally, B'kohanim Bisman Shebeis HaMikdash Kayim Shayu Omdim Al Duchanim Uvarchan Es Yisrael Shema Meforash. The Kohanim, looking at Kohanim while they're duchening, is only considered wrong in the times when the temple is standing, because there the Shekhinah would rest on their fingertips when they would bless the people. Our minhag is not to look at Kohanim even Bisman Hazeh, but technically, the only reason that it presents a problem for your eyesight is because in the Beis HaMikdash the Shekhinah rested on their fingertips. Today, the Shekhinah doesn't rest on the fingertips of the Kohanim, but people say, but still, nevertheless, you shouldn't look. If you look once, you go blind in one eye. You look twice, you go blind in the other eye. What if you look 3 times?
You can't see the 3 times.
Okay. Darash, the old joke. Okay. Darash Rabbi Yehuda b'Rabbi Nachmani Meturgamani Deresh Lakish. Mai dichsiv al taminu b'ra al tivtechu va'aluf. So this is the Meturgaman. In other words, the Meturgamans were great scholars as well, even though they were there to announce the Torah of the Rosh Hashiva. But you had to be a Talmud Chacham to be able to do that. So this is one of the Meturgamans. His name is Rabbi Yehuda b'Rabbi Nachmani. He's the Meturgaman of Reish Lakish, and he expounded as follows. What does the pasuk mean when it says, "Do not place your faith in the Ra," which usually means the evil, and "Al tiftechu v'aluf," don't trust the officer, the aluf. So, "Im yomer lecha yetzer hara chato v'HaKadosh Baruch Hu moichel al ta'amein." It means that if the yetzer hara, which is called Ra, tells you, go ahead and sin, and don't worry, Hashem will be moichel you, because Hashem is a forgiving God, don't believe him. And how do you know this? Because it says, Al tamein bara ve'ein ra el yetzer hara. Because the word ra is a reference to the yetzer hara. So Al tamein, don't believe the ra, don't believe the yetzer hara. Shnemar ki yetzer lev ha'adam ra. As the pasuk says that the inclination of man is ra. That tells us that the yetzer hara is called ra. Ve'ein aluf el HaKadosh Baruch Hu shnemar aluf ne'uri ata. And Hashem is called the aluf, the ultimate officer, because he says, I have been your father and your aluf, you my youth. Shema Tomar mi may it be, and maybe you'll say, okay, fine, so maybe God is seeing me, but there have to be witnesses in order for me to be convicted in Shemayim. Who's going to testify against me? The answer is, Avnei Vesa v'Koros Beso Shel Adam Hei Me'idin Bo. It is the stones and the beams, the 2x4s and the studs of a person's house that are going to testify against him for all the things, like, when you were watching that stuff on the internet, no one was watching except the walls of your house, right?
The walls have ears.
The walls have ears. Shenemar, ki even mekir tizak v'chapis me'etz ya'anena. That it says, the stone from the wall shall cry out, and the piece of wood shall respond. V'chachamim omrim, or the chachamim, some say that the girsa is acherim, but or some say it's Rebbe Zreika, and they say nishmaso shel adam me'idabo, that a person's own soul testifies about him. You don't need the walls of your house. Your own neshama will cry out, "Hey, I've been stained. I've been accosted by this person, by this body." Shenemar mushkeves cheikecha shemor pischei picha, as it says, that which rests in your bosom, you have to be careful of what comes out of your mouth. Ezu hidavar sheshocheves b'cheiko shel adam. What rests in a man's bosom? Hevi omer zu neshama. That's the neshama. And Reb Zreika omer shnei malachei asharis amalavin osein me'idin bo. It's the 2 angels that escort you everywhere you go. Like the devil angel, the good angel, right? On each shoulder, the devil and the angel, right? Those are the 2 malachim that escort you wherever you go. And they are the ones who testify about you. As it says, his angels will give you charge to watch over you in all of your ways. And and others say that it is a person's own physical limbs which will testify against him. That you are my witnesses, says Hashem. In other words, you're the very person who's doing the Aveira, you shall be my witnesses, says Hashem. And I am the Lord. Okay, let's go on to the next Mishnah. Now, this Mishnah is descriptive of the oldest known machlokes in Chazal over an issue of Torah Shebaal Peh. And the point, one of the important points that we'll see is that this machlokes is not over a biblical law. This machlokes is over a rabbinic law, over a shvus called smicha. Smicha is the law that the Torah says many times when you bring a korban, you have to first press down on the animal with all of your weight. And and that's a biblical requirement. The question is, can you do smicha on Yantif or not? So this goes back all the way to the very first of the Zugos, in the early Second Temple era, that this was a debate whether a person can do smicha on Yantif when he brings his korban Chagiga, and that's why it's here. So Yosef ben Yoezer Omer Shalo Lismoch, Yosef ben Yochanan Omer Lismoch. The first Zug, the Yosef ben Yoezer says, do smicha. Yosef ben Yochanan says, no, you're not allowed to do smicha. Now we go to the next generation of Zugos. Yoshua ben Prachi Omer Shalo Lismoch, Nitei Harbeli Omer Lismoch. One says yes, one says no. Yehuda ben Tabai Omer Shalo Lismoch, Shimon ben Shetach Omer Lismoch. Next generation. Shmaya Omer Lismoch, Avtalion Omer Shalo Lismoch. Next generation. Now in this generation of Hillel, originally the Zugos were not Hillel and Shammai. Originally they were Hillel and Menachem. Be a great study to find out what happened to Menachem. The Gemara will talk a little bit about it. But can you imagine this guy Menachem? No one knows about him. But originally he was supposed to be Hillel's partner in leading the Jewish people. And originally, when it was just Menachem and Hillel, they both agreed and that you should do smicha on Yantif. But Yatza Menachem left for some reason, we don't know yet why, and Nichna Shammai, and Shammai comes in his stead. Shammai Omer Shalo Lismoch, Hillel Omer Lismoch. And Shammai said, don't do smicha, and Hillel said, you could do smicha. Harishonim hayunesim ushnim lahem av beistin. Now, when you look at this list that we've just enumerated, the first name on the list is the Nasi, which is the number one in command of the rabbinic leadership of the Jewish people. And the second name on the list is the Av Beistin. Now, this is going to be relevant for the ensuing discussion when we talk about Rabbi Yehuda ben Tabai and Shimon ben Shetach. Now, remember, in our list, Yehuda ben Tabai says, don't do smicha, and Shimon ben Shetach says, you do smicha. So it sounds like, based on this last line of the Mishnah, that Yehuda ben Tabai was the Nasi, and Shimon ben Shetach was the Av Beistin. So just keep that in mind. The Gemara now says, Tana Rabbanan, Shlosha mizugos harishonim sha'amru shalo lismoch, u'shnai mizugos ha'achronim sha'amru lismoch, hayu nisiyim. U'shniyim lahem avos beistin diver Reb Meir. So Reb Meir is of the opinion that of this sequence of generations of Zugos, the first three generations of Zugos, you had the Nisiyim saying that you should not do smicha, and Ushniyim mezugos and Ushnayim rather, and two people from the Zugos Achronim Shamru Lismoch, and two of the Nisiyim from the last two generations said Shamru Lismoch, they were Nisiyim. In other words, the first three generations of Zugos, all the Nisiyim said don't do smicha. The last two generations that were enumerated, the Nisiyim said to do smicha, and the Av Beistins were just the opposite. That's according to Reb Meir. The Chachamim say, no, we disagree. Yehuda ben Tabai, who was the one who said, don't do smicha, who you say was the Nasi, Reb Meir, we hold he was the Av Beistin. Shimon ben Shetach was the Nasi. So there's a machlokas about specifically Yehuda ben Tabai and Shimon ben Shetach. Which one was the Nasi and which one was the Av Beistin? According to Reb Meir, Yehuda ben Tabai was the Nasi, Shimon ben Shetach was the Av Beistin, and according to the Chachamim, Shimon ben Shetach was the Nasi, and Yehuda ben Tabai was the Av Beistin. Why is it relevant? You'll see from the following story. Man Tana Lahadatana Rabbanan. So who's the author of the following brisa? Which, if you recall, you come into the Perek Shir, we talked about this Gemara. Amar Rabbi Yehuda ben Tabai, Era bin Achama, im lo harakti eid zomim, lahotzi miliban shel tzdukim. That I do declare that I properly put to death an eid zomim, a false witness, and in so doing, I also accomplished a repudiation of the tzedukim, shahayu omrim ein eidim zomim neherogim ad sheyahareg hanido. Because they used to say that if a witness testifies falsely, in a capital case, the only time that you would put that false witness to death is if he succeeded in getting the Beis Din to execute the accused. But if you haven't yet succeeded in getting the Beis Din to execute the accused, then you would never put that witness to death. But we hold just the opposite. We say, Va'asisim lo kasher zamam lasos, that you do to the witness to the false witness that which he attempted to do, that which he collaborated to do to the accused, not that which he succeeded to do to the accused. And therefore, just the opposite. If we actually already executed the accused, then we don't put the false witness to death. But it's only if it's before we executed the accused that we discover he's a false witness, then we put that false witness to death. So therefore, I was right. I did a good thing, says Rabbi Yehuda ben Tabai. We chopped this guy, we discovered he was a liar, and we put him to death before we'd have to execute the accused. So Amar lo Shimon ben Shetach, Era bin Achama, im lo shafach l'dam naki, sheharei amru chachamim ein edim zomim in neheragin ad sheyazumu shneihem, ve'ein lokin ad sheyazumu shneihem, ve'mishaman mamon ad sheyazumu shneihem. That Shimon ben Shetach says, to the contrary, Rabbi Yehuda ben Tabai, I do declare that you spilled innocent blood, that this man did not deserve to die, even though he was a false witness. Because even though you're correct that you're supposed to execute the witnesses if they collaborate to harm the accused before the accused is executed, but that's only when you discover that both witnesses have been proven to be Edom Zomamin. But if you only one out of the two witnesses are discovered to be Edom Zomamin, then you're not allowed to punish that sole witness. You only punish the witnesses either with death or lashes, whatever they collaborated to do to the accused. That's what you do to them, only if both of them are discovered to be liars. And in your case, only one of them was proven to be a liar, and therefore you had no right to execute him. So miyad kibel olav Yehuda ben Tabai she'enu mara halacha ela b'fnei Shimon ben Shetach. And from that point onwards, Yehuda ben Tabai, realizing that he made this tragic error and putting a man to death that didn't deserve to be put to death, he accepted upon himself that he would never again paskin any halacha unless it was together with Shimon ben Shetach. So kol yamav shel Yehuda ben Tabai haya mishtateach al kibur shel oso harug. That for the rest of his life, Yehuda ben Tabai would prostrate himself over the grave of this fellow, v'haya kolo nishma, and he would wail, and everyone could hear his voice in moaning. Kisvurim ha'am lomar shekolo shel harugu. And everyone thought that it was the ghost of this man that was executed that was making all this noise. And so Amar Lahem Kolihu. And Yehuda ben Tabai says, no, there's no ghost here that's wailing. It's my voice. And Teidu Shalamacher Hu Meis Vein Kolo Nishma. And I'll prove it to you, because when I die tomorrow or sometime in the future, you won't hear the voice anymore. And that'll prove that it was my voice that was wailing, not the voice of the ghost of this man. So Amarle Rav Acha Berei Derava the Rav Ashi V'Dilmi Piyusei Paisei Obedina Tave. So that's not necessarily a proof. I mean, we finished the Brisa, but there's a question on the Brisa. How could Yehuda ben Tabai prove that it wasn't the voice of the ghost, but rather his own voice, just because it would stop after Yehuda ben Tabai died? Maybe once Yehuda ben Tabai died and his soul went up to Shemayim, he would succeed in appeasing, getting mechila from the person that he had executed. Or maybe the executed Neshama would take him to a din Torah and take vengeance upon Yehuda ben Tabai, and that's why he stopped wailing. But you don't have any proof that it wasn't the ghost, just because it stopped, the sound stopped once Yehuda ben Tabai died. So that's not the point of the story. That requires further analysis. But the point of the story is that we see that Yehuda ben Tabai, before this incident, was paskening shailas independently of Shimon ben Shetach. So the Gemara therefore says, money ha. So according to whom is this brisa? Iyamart bishlama Reb Meir d'Amar Shimon ben Shetach av beis and Reb Yehuda ben Tabai nasi hainu dekamari halacha b'fnei Shimon ben Shetach. If you hold like Reb Meir that Reb Yehuda ben Tabai was the nasi and Shimon ben Shetach was his subordinate, then it makes sense why Yehuda ben Tabai, up until this episode, felt at liberty to paskin shailas in Shimon ben Shetach's absence, because he was the nasi, he was the superior. But Ela Iyamar Rabbanan Dharma Yehuda ben Tabai av based in Shimon ben Shetach nasi, av based in Mifnei nasi mimora halacha. But if you're going to tell me, like the Chachamim say, that Shimon ben Shetach was the nasi and Yehuda ben Tabai was the av based in, then even before this story happened, what right did Yehuda ben Tabai to take it upon himself to paskin on a capital case without consulting first with Shimon ben Shetach? So it must be that this brisa goes like Reb Meir. So the Gemara says lo, not necessarily so. My kibul alav dika amar, because maybe in reality Shimon ben Shetach was out of town, and when it says that from that point onwards Yehuda ben Tabai accepted upon himself never again to paskin without Shimon ben Shetach, it doesn't mean that he wasn't already subordinate to Shimon ben Shetach, but what he meant to say is that even in the future, if Shimon ben Shetach is out of town, and really I will be sort of the sub, and I'll be able to paskin, I swear that I will never do so ever again. In other words, really it could be that Yehuda ben Tabai was always the Av Beis Din, always the subordinate to Shimon ben Shetach. But when the boss is not home and the second in command is there to take over, he presides over the Beis Din. And what Yehuda ben Tabai accepted upon himself is, I'm not doing that anymore. If Shimon ben Shetach is ever out of town ever again, I'm going to make sure that even if there are other dayanim present, I'm not going to paskin without Shimon ben Shetach.
You're talking about capital cases or all cases?
It sounds like, even in all cases, it sounds like, because the Gemara doesn't make that distinction.
I'm just so confused. How does somebody paskin for capital cases alone? Where's the rest of this Beis Din?
Well, because he was presiding, and it could be that Tosfos discusses this as well, as far as the other dayanim, and as far as being part. It could be that his vote was the final vote that incriminated the guy. Notice, because in capital cases you don't start with the head, you start from the lowest. So it could be that they were 50-50, and Yehuda ben Tabai was the deciding vote, and it was because of him that this guy was put to death, and he's therefore said, "I'm never doing this again." Okay, Yatsa Menachem inichna Shammai. So Menachem leaves, and Shammai takes his place. The Gemara is going to ask, who was this Menachem? What happened to him? So Laichan Yatsa, where did he go? Abaya Omer Yatsa Latarbus Ra. Abaya says, just like Acher, he went off the derech. So this is a very, very, very scary time in rabbinic leadership when you have Gedolei Hador, jumping ship, right? I mean, it happened to Acher, happens to this fellow Menachem, according to Abaya. Very scary time. You got to watch your rabbis. Keep an eye on the rabbis.
So we know why it happened.
Like the other Beatle. The camera.
What?
Yeah.
The Havdil is like the other Beatle.
The first drummer.
The other Beatle.
The first drummer.
What was his name? Brian's.
It's before Ringo, right?
What's that?
It was Brian something. No, it was one of them died of a brain tumor, I think. The original drummer. Okay, anyway.
But Acher, we know why he went
okay, Erev Rosh Hashanah, let's go. Rava Amar.
Some music.
Yeah, Rava Amar, that's only Greek music. Rava Amar, Yatsa la'avodas hamelech. Right, Rava says no, he went because he was conscripted. That's why I'm understanding the Gemara is because he was conscripted. He went to go into the king's army. I don't think it means voluntarily, because why would he leave voluntarily to go? He was conscripted. Tanya nami hachi, Yatsa menachem la'avodas hamelech, v'yatsa imo shmonim zugos talmidim levushim si that the Braysta tells us, confirms, like Rabbi said, not that he went off the derech, but Menachem went to serve the king, and 80 pairs of Talmidim also went wearing uniforms to go and serve the king. Now, it's also possible that it wasn't through conscription. It could be that they felt they were doing their patriotic duty, whatever you're going to say. But sadly, Menachem was lost to history because he left his post as the Av Beis Din, or the Nasi. Amr of Shaman bar Abba, Amr of Yechanan, La'olam alta heshuvos kala beinecha. So he says now that never let a rabbinic prohibition be light in your eyes. Shaharei smicha eina ela mishum shavus, v'nech lekupa gedoilei hador. Because you see that this smicha is only prohibited at best because of a shavus on Yantif, because of a rabbinic injunction. And yet you see all these generations of Gedolei Yisrael were in dispute about it. So the Gemara says Pshita. So, like Shkoyach Rav Shaman, what are you telling me that is not self-evident from the Mishnah? The Gemara answers Shavus Mitzvah Tzarichalei. It's telling me that even though the Shavus is in opposition to a mitzvah like Smicha, you still have to be concerned about it and not just be so dismissive. So the Gemara says, but Hanami Pshita. But that's also self-evident from the Mishnah, because that's what Smicha is. Smicha is doing a mitzvah which involves a potential rabbinic violation on Yantif or Shabbos, and that's exactly what they're arguing about. So again, Rav Shaman, what are you telling me that I don't already see? La'afuki miman da'amar bismicha gufa pligi, kamash balan bishvusu de pligi. So the Gemara answers like this. There's another way to read our Mishnah. It could be that the reason why they're arguing about whether or not to do smicha is not because there's a potential prohibition of using an animal on Yantif, which is, we'll see, is the issue over here, mishtamish b'bal chai, that you're utilizing an animal on Yantif by pressing down on it, But rather the issue over here is whether or not there's bichlal a mitzvah of smicha on a korban chagiga. Because after all, the Torah says to do smicha when you're bringing a korban nedava, a voluntary gift offering, and we extrapolate from there that any personal korban that you bring, you have to do smicha. You might have thought that the machlokas here is whether or not a korban chagiga warrants smicha at all, regardless of whether you bring it on Yontif or Chol HaMoed. And that's the machlokas. So comes along Rav Shammai to tell you, no, the issue over here is everyone agrees that there's a mitzvah of smicha on a korban chagiga. What's at issue here is specifically on Yontif, whether or not you're permitted to do smicha or not. So Amar Rami Bar Chama Shma Mina smicha b'chol kocho ba'inan. But you see from this discussion that smicha is a pressing down on the animal's back with all your strength. The Isal kadaitach lo ba'inan b'chol kocho ma'ika avid lismoch. Because if your suggestion is that you can just place your hands lightly on the animal's back, well then that doesn't involve any shavus derabbanan, that doesn't involve any kind of utilization of an animal that would in any way the rabbis would prohibit. So therefore you see from here that it's only an issue of, you see that when you do smicha, you have to press with all your strength, and that's why there are some rabbis who say you can't do this because you're utilizing an animal on Yontif. Just like you're not allowed to ride an animal on Yontif, so too you're not allowed to press down with all your weight on an animal's back before you bring the korban.